You're listening to How to Build a Better World, the Fifth Estates podcast where we call on the experts and leaders to explore the big ecological, social, and financial problems of our time. In this episode, our managing editor, Tina Perinotto, spoke with Amy Marks from Autodesk, who's the queen of prefab, on why building and construction is not an industry, but an ecosystem. If the world's buildings and cities are set to triple their footprint, as forecasters predict, sustainability will be a mighty challenge. Firstly, where are we sourcing our diminishing materials from? And can we still build and construct the way we've done traditionally? Amy Marks is head of industrialised construction strategy and evangelism at the global technology company Autodesk. She says so much needs to change. Her job is to transform building and construction so that it's way more efficient and sustainable. This would have multiple dividends for businesses and the planet. Amy is one of those brilliant American outperformers that rightfully stand out on the global stage. She's educated at Harvard, a successful entrepreneur, and a great thinker. Thankfully, for the building and construction industry, she's made her voice one to be reckoned with. This includes in Australia and New Zealand, where she has visited often. She's also made good friends with David Chandler. David, as most of our listeners will know, was a frequent contributor to the Fifth Estate before the New South Wales government tapped him on the shoulder to become Building Commissioner. This job is all about reforming building and construction after some high-profile disasters such as the Eiffel Tower at Homebush in Sydney. Amy has a lot in common with David because they're both disruptors. For example, she says building and construction is not an industry. It's an ecosystem, and this means it can't be disrupted or reformed from the bottom up. It has to be disrupted from the top down. She means by influential clients such as large corporates or governments who can demand new outcomes through different methodologies. She's focused on the value and efficiency of digitalisation and prefabrication. These are the ways that we can start to conserve and repurpose our dwindling natural resources. In construction, a wastage rate of 30% is common. New technologies can go a long way to solving that wastage problem, and they can also help the sector integrate new building materials that are more sustainable and efficient. Amy has construction in her blood. Her family owned a construction management company in New York, and she grew up on construction sites. So it's no surprise she's such a fascinating person to talk to about this sector.
So welcome to our next episode of our podcast called How to Build a Better World. And I'm welcoming as our guest Amy Marks, who's got a very senior role with Autodesk. Amy's working in the area of prefabrication, which is literally one of the most amazing ways to be able to save resources because of the incredible amount of waste that we have in construction. So Amy, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So Amy's talking to us from New Jersey. And first up, Amy, I want to ask you what exactly you're doing in Autodesk and how you've come there and what your passion is.
Sure. So I'm actually the global head of industrialized construction strategy and evangelism at Autodesk. So I am really passionate about the application of manufacturing techniques to the built environment. So everything from the mega trends of prefabrication, automation and robotics, additive manufacturing, all of those sort of advanced building methodologies, as well as all the enablers like BIM and design for manufacturing and assembly and lean manufacturing. So I'm really passionate about building things a better way.
That's fantastic, and it's so important, as I say, to cutting the resources we use in building and construction. But Amy, you've come to Autodesk from your own business, haven't you?
I did. I was a small certified woman-owned business for over 10 years. As one of the first prefabrication consultants working with big end users and big governments around the world, helping them to optimize the integration of prefabrication and design for manufacturing and assembly. So I worked on a lot of strategy in a lot of places around the world.
That's fantastic. And I just discovered in our chat before we started the formal interview that you've got a lot of connections to Australia, including the most amazing David Chandler.
I am very close friends with David Chandler for years. We are both very passionate people, I think. So how do you not run into David Chandler? I think the first time I ever met him, we were talking about crane underutilization and optimization. I think I actually read an article and that's how we met. And he read something on me and we became friends. Yeah, and I've actually run conferences there for the last 10 years. I have lots of friends in the supply chain there, Kavanaugh Industries, and Andrew Fowler from Ostrus, and even the AMCA, AMC, the manufacturers, sorry, the Mechanical Contractors Association there. I've actually spoken for them, and I have a lot of friends in the supply chain, FrameCAD down there, and also I'm a rugby player. I should tell you, I was a rugby union player for many years. So like every time I go to Australia, it's like going home.
Oh my God. And you
Yeah.
ran conferences here as well, you say?
I did. I used to be the keynote and the content provider of, usually I came once a year to Sydney and Melbourne. So Dr. Tuan at the University of Melbourne and Mary Hardy at Western Sydney. So I ran some prefabrication conferences for many years. And also, interestingly enough, I worked with a lot of big clients down there in the past. A lot of the developers and builders. So it's funny. I know Australia really well, and New Zealand. It's sort of like old home for me.
That's fantastic. Great to hear. So taking us back to your field of work, can you tell us what you're working on? What is the main problem that you're trying to solve in your work?
It's interesting. I think that there's a couple of big issues, one of which is we've survived so long on a cash for chaos mentality.
Oh, can you explain that, please?
Yeah, I think, we've been a very siloed industry for so long, and it's not because we're not smart and don't understand how to close the gaps of the silos. I think it's the opposite. We've really, and not in a nefarious way, but the way in which the industry has made money has typically been between lack of information between the silos, handoffs that are not quite complete between the silos. And that's how people have typically made money in the construction industry for so long that that's why the margins have gotten smaller and things are getting harder, because people are looking for more and more transparency, and it's hard to make money from chaos when there's transparency. So I think I'm very passionate about closing those gaps and getting people digitized and getting them on sort of a maturity stack of different capabilities in order to move away from that mentality and move towards more certainty through the data.
Well, that's really interesting. And I've had a lot of conversations with David about this because he wrote for the Fifth Estate for a few years before he became commissioner and got tapped on the shoulder, I think partly because of our articles, I like to think. But tell me about this culture that's led to these problems of chaos.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, this is not an industry, right? So,
what do you mean by that?
I'm sure everybody uses the words disruptive technology or to disrupt the industry or it's actually, and so that comes from Clayton Christensen's books, on the innovator's dilemma. And he talked a lot about the fact that we're going to disrupt this an industry can be disrupted from the bottom moving up, right? So, chipping away at the bottom and moving up in the world. Unfortunately, we're not that, so I've been writing a paper recently called The Innovator's Deception. We're more of an ecosystem. And you really can't disrupt an ecosystem from the bottom up. You have to do that from the top down. You've got to do that with tech. You have to do that with the biggest players in the world. It's one of the reasons why I came to Autodesk. You have to have big platforms, big resources, and big, ROI and reasons to eliminate and to really wipe out that cash for chaos mentality. There's got to be drivers for getting rid of that. And really, this ecosystem is very collaborative and interactive regardless of what's going on. And we've worked, and many people have been in this space for a long time and set in their ways. And, I always say, Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Like you could have a great plan, but at the end of the day, if that's the way we have always been and want to be, you can tell people there's a better way and they may not change until they have to. Or until they get wiped off the face of the earth. Usually that's the next thing that happens if they don't change, to be honest.
That is fantastic. So that's really interesting. And this kind of issue came up a bit at our last event, which is an all-day one that we have called Tomorrowland, which is pretty big for us. And David was there again. And he said something that really made me pay attention. He said that, he's trying to change the course in the building and construction industry, because there's a lot of problems that I'm sure you're aware of with building failures and, terrible outcomes, especially in the residential sector. And he said, not all the parts of the industry are at the table discussing issues and trying to come up with sort of industry policies. So kind of it makes me think, what you just said, it's not an industry, it's an ecosystem, which is really fascinating.
Right. Yeah, an ecosystem actually behaves differently than an industry, and you need to engage people differently when it's an ecosystem than an industry, right? Industries are a lot smaller, and they're all sort of driving in the same direction typically. We're a few different, several different industries and several different stakeholders, and we're all moving in different directions with different drivers, with different levels of maturity of digitization, and we make money in different ways. So that we're sort of like all, I don't want to say we work at cross purposes, but we're definitely not all moving in the same direction to think just if you get people to the table would fix that. You have to really align the drivers for more productive workforce and actually for more, complex designs. As listen, there's a tsunami of issues in this industry that people are just starting to recognize that have been here for a long time. I remember years ago when I was in Australia, when the car companies had just moved out, and we were talking about how do you keep that labor in Australia? How do you keep the really technical manufacturing labor there? Well, guess what? We could certainly use them now as we shift towards a more, industrialized construction processes. And you're in a real change in the environment for, obviously COVID has created some pressure, but it didn't start with COVID, right? It started with really, I call them serial owners, the owners that have highly technical backgrounds that are all about certainty. And I use that serial owners phrase on purpose. It's like a little bit grim, but it's almost like serial killers. They have a fingerprint and a signature in the way they want their buildings built every time. And that's because they're looking for operational consistency and performance for several reasons. But they're driving a lot of this change in the space because they're big, they have a lot of business, and they have a lot of cash, right? But it's not just them. Then you've got, governments, and like, I love where David is now, and I'm sure he's super happy. You've got governments like what's going on in Australia and in Singapore and in the UK, where they're doing $3 billion worth of schools, where they are requiring you to be digitized and to use industrialized construction. And look at sustainability practices. So you've got like governments asking for it, incentivizing it even. And you're seeing in this industry, in this ecosystem, there are certain parts of the ecosystem that are actually making money more than others, that are providing value and gaining value from it, and others that are not. So there's sort of the have and the have-nots on this digital divide and on this innovation side, right?
Fantastic. So tell us about industrializing the process. What's the potential there in the US and in Australia? And maybe you can compare the two, seeing you know us as well.
Yeah, it's funny. The only thing I'll say about the difference between Australia and the US is not much, other than I love that, every time I'm there in Australia, they're like, we just don't have the scale, mate. And I'm like, you do. Like, everyone has the scale.
What's funny enough was talking. Sorry, can you explain?
Like, we're not big enough to make a difference almost. Like, you can't, it's like, well, the US is so big and there's so many companies and there's so much building. And I'm like, you don't have to be big to be good,
right,
or better, and I think they sort of, you have to, like, especially when I'm in New Zealand, by the way, for the record, every time I'm in New Zealand, then they talk about scale. They say like, oh, forget the guys in Australia. They don't know scale. We have a scale issue, and I'm like, okay, it has nothing to do with scale. It's more about being innovative. And it's funny, I just recently wrote an article for a magazine called ENR, Engineering News Record in the US. And it was called The Rise of the MEP Subcontractor as the new
what sort of subcontractor,
right?
Sorry,
the new, sort of like the rise of the new manufacturer. And in our ecosystem, that's the MEP subcontractor, right? It's like these MEP subcontractors are really more like manufacturers these days, right? They all have fab shops. And same in the US, right? I don't care if you're small or medium or large, they're doing all kinds of prefabrication. They're putting more of their investment into that. And that's the same everywhere you go. The more complex the designs and the more heavy MEP they have, the more prefabrication is happening. And they're quiet innovators. They're humble innovators in a lot of ways. And they're reaping the values in the value chain right now because they're putting in the investment, and they're doing industrialized construction almost in spite of the general contractor, the tier one builder, and the architects, right? It's like, it's happening from that part of the ecosystem, because if not, they would cease to almost survive, right? It's like they don't have the labor anymore, and they don't have everything they need. So it's almost like you're in a better space in Australia because you have necessity. Like sometimes necessity is better than, gluttony, as you say. If you have everything, you don't really need to change anything. So the fact that you're on an island, obviously, and you've got limited resources in some ways, like everybody else, the more that happens to you, those pressures, those constraints actually make you better at being more innovative. So these two guys today were friends of mine, David Evans from Star Electric and Bob Snyder from Binsky & Snyder in the US. They're smaller mechanical contractor, electrical subcontractors. They're doing more prefab than anybody. You know, you don't need to be a 9 billion euro company to do industrialized construction. They're just thinking about things differently with the constraints they have on resources and cash. And I think you're seeing a move towards need now. We've moved away from it would be a nice to have to it must happen because we just don't have the resources around the world.
I'm really interested to hear you say that, Amy. In particular, we hear all the time that we're going to triple the amount of built environment that we have over the next 20 or 30 years. And I just keep wondering, where are the resources going to come from? We're running out of resources, like sand, for instance.
Yeah.
And we're hearing stories about people stealing sand from the mangroves in places like Southeast Asia.
Well, I think you have to look at resources and, sustainability in a few different ways, right? So there's like sustainability from the perspective of like, yes, we'd like to use less of the energy in building these buildings and less physical resources, less embedded carbon when we're selecting materials and things like that. And that we need, obviously. We only have a finite amount of resources on this planet, and it shouldn't be based on someone's opinion, and it shouldn't be based on, my knowledge in my head. That needs to be, and it is in lots of cases, like we have some great calculators within Revit that allow you to understand carbon, right? So that needs to live somewhere. The issue with other parts of the sustainability, spectrum, which there's really, our industry sustainability, if you will, or the many industries we have within this ecosystem. And how do we sustain an industry that can't attract people to work here and can't attract younger people to work here? How do we do that when we're not integrating technology? How do we do that when we don't have real-time connections to the supply chain on our phones? How do we do that when we don't have all the bells and whistles that they have when I always say, why can I order shoes off my phone with a direct connection to the supply chain in China? But when I do something as an architect, I'm doing it sort of in a vacuum sometimes, which makes no sense. And so I think one of the parts of the spectrum of sustainability is we've got to really figure out, like, we have a limited amount of knowledge left in craftsmanship and especially in my part of the industry in prefabrication technology and innovations and methodologies, that it can't live with me and moving us to the front of the process just to talk about it. It's really why I was driven to come to Autodesk. Like everything that David Chandler has learned over his lifetime, or Andrew Fowler or myself or Aidan Kavanagh or Sumit Oberoi, anyone I know in Australia that knows what they're talking about, that needs to live in technology, and that needs to be replicated and create and optimize through machine learning and through AI, and that be better than what I can do by hand but with my own mind. So there's a sustainability piece of our industry with the lack of resources of people and diversity that we have in this and understanding. And I think the other part is, there's community sustainability that we don't really often look at the resources. That it would be great if we could build all those buildings and be able to do that while sustaining the communities in which those people live in with jobs and skill sets and technology, so that we're not just all shifting and moving things around the world to other places. It would be great if we could create jobs for people in Australia with businesses in Australia, the same thing for Africa, the same thing for the United States. I hear it everywhere around the world. Just because we can ship things around the world doesn't mean we should. And I think like it would be good to A, save the carbon footprint, and B, empower and enable those people that live in those places to have a more sustainable community that they can prosper from some of this that we need to build.
Yeah, so a lot of the problems that we're seeing in construction is because there is a disconnect between the architect and what they want to see in the building, and what actually gets substituted there unbeknownst to them, quite often unbeknownst to the developer. So someone, they're pushing to push, to get the builder goes in and tenders for the price. So you get this, race to the bottom, as they call it.
Yeah.
That's a massive problem, isn't it? And then the builder says, oh, the architect doesn't know what they're talking about. I'll put this in. And then you've got substitution issues. So
they're not currently incentivized to know what to really create the real stuff, right? So like think about what we're just saying. Like you're basically just describing that cash for chaos conversation, right? That there's these silos and that people have to, I always say to owners, just because you push risk to somebody else does not mean it went away, right? And risk costs money, right? Like they will put money on risk, which is why everything's getting more and more expensive. But at the same time, that's what we say. And we're doing that behavior in one side of our business. On the other side, we're talking about the fact that we spend less money in digitization than any other industry on the planet, with the exception of architecture and agriculture, or sorry, with the exception of hunting and agriculture, which I always think we're dead last. I don't even know how we came in second to dead last. But so now I just said risk costs money because no one's willing to collaborate to remove it. And we don't spend money on digitization like other industries. Well, we do. We just put it in the wrong place. And I explained it like this today. I asked the gentleman that were on the phone today, if you think about, because no one will ever tell you this number, the money you put on top of jobs to mitigate your risk, which, contingency, design contingency, fabrication contingency, whatever, all these contingencies, could you, if I said today, you'll never have to use that money, and I want you to move that money up to innovation in the front of the process, what would that do to your business? And they were like, it would be beyond transformational. But I can never do that because no one's removing this risk. So therefore, now what that's like saying is like, I have a 12-year-old daughter. Now she's a really good girl, so maybe she wouldn't do this. But if I give her $20 to go to the store and say, you only need 5, but I give you a 20, she's not coming back with 15. I don't really care how good your kid is. They're not coming back with $15, right? They're going to spend all 20 somehow. And that's what we're doing in this industry. We are putting this money in the wrong part of the process. We're spending it and we're not getting anything for it. So
the lawyers are getting a lot for it, aren't they? Because there's a whole lot of adversarial processes that are embedded in the system. So they're doing well, aren't they?
Now, ask me why we haven't changed the contractual methodology and procurement methods that lawyers inform us that we can't change up front in the process. Ask me why they wouldn't want to have that changed. Why do we have to have this many bidders? Can't we partner? Why can't we have some? Well, because the guys that make what you just said, according to you, right? Like the guys at the end of the process that make more money are not going to remove that risk up front to not make money at the end.
Yeah.
Right? Like we have to think logically all the time now. Right?
But where else culturally how could you remove that system of adversariality in construction and the legal system, which is very powerful and actually holds back sustainability in property leasing? For instance, green leases, tenants and landlords, they tell the tenants to agree to nothing at all because it could be they could screw the landlord some other way, whatever.
Right. I mean, how do we run an ecosystem without the lawyer influence, like changing our behaviors? I mean, look, we all just have to change our behaviors one company at a time. There's actually a book, it's called It Takes One. It's always on my, It Starts With One is the name. And it talks about change. And listen, most of these guys, it's not that they don't want to change. It's that they've been around for 50 years, 100 years, 80 years. And there is some success they've had, right? So it's like when I go and talk to a $4 billion company in Australia, or even, I don't care, a $300 million contractor, they look at me and say, well, I've gotten this far. But it doesn't mean that it's going to get them further. And unfortunately, when the environments change and technology changes and the labor changes and everything changes, they are now doing what used to be the right thing really, really well. They're now doing the wrong thing, and they're still doing it fairly well, which is why their margins are small. Unfortunately, when they want to change or pressures happen from the environment and outside of technology and labor, usually they don't actually change their process. They actually double down on what they've done before, which honestly will get you a little incremental change. And that's bad because it'll think you're moving it makes you feel as a leader, you're moving in the right direction. But in reality, you're just getting further in the hole of still doing the wrong thing. You just brute forced it to be a little bit better. When in reality, you have to start learning to do new right things. And that takes a cultural change within companies. That takes us understanding that this is the long game. That's why I'm very interested in digitization and productization over time, as opposed to I always talk about a product-led mentality, not a project-centric industry that's tied to one particular project. We will never get ahead if we think project-centrically. So I love, for culture, look, I try to surround myself with people that I would want to work for, that are actually innovative, that it's okay to fail within parameters, and that I'm learning, and that we've created some way in which that we can test things out and pilot things. And I always love a benevolent dictator. That's sort of how I feel at this point in our industry. I feel like you need benevolent dictators to be like, we're doing this. Don't take no for an answer, right? Like Honda used to have this, if you can go watch on one of the TED Talks, they talk about kicking the ladder out. What if somebody just said, no, we will do this. I don't care you just figure it out. That's what Honda used to do. They used to, the president.
Who's that?
Honda, the car company.
Yes.
Yeah. The car company would go out in the press, and the CEO would say, we have this car coming out next year. It's going to have a performance like this, and it's going to be at a price point of X. And the VPs in the background would be like, we do. And they would be like, we do now. So like, they would have to figure it out. Like he kicked the ladder out from underneath. They had to change. So we're getting close to that because we won't exist on the planet. There's big disruptions that are coming, but in reality, I would hope that we shift and pivot to a more, to really focus on drivers of certainty. And really, again, you get that through digitizing and through data. It's like, you have to move away from faith. And really the guys that are doing outcome-based studies, Matt Steer and Matt Keen and at Autodesk have really talked a lot about this. You have to move away from faith, where we know things are good for ourselves in our guts. And maybe even like you've seen some correlation, like you can be like, yeah, that I saw it work over there. And we've now got to move to causation through digital transformation and data. You have to be able to have data that actually you have predictability and certainty from. And you can't really do that alone with means and methods. You have to productize. You have to move towards more manufacturing techniques. You have to move towards partnering and less about bidding and wasted transactions. You really do have to move towards a more where predictability. I had an owner recently say to me, certainty is better than savings for us every time. And I think we ask too much of new innovations to be cheaper and faster and better. In reality, we're not on time or on budget right now. So it's like, I just want innovations to be on time and on budget within quality standards. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I think we have to really look at ourselves with a hard look in the mirror and change our culture and change our drivers and maybe get some more benevolent dictators, right? Like a little bit more diversity in thought.
That sounds pretty good. What about the big disruptors that are coming? You've mentioned that. What do you perceive as that's coming over the next 3 to 5 years? Or
yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, look, McKinsey just put out a report that said 45% of the current AEC processes are going to move towards industrialized construction. It's obviously my passion. That's half the value in our industry is going to move towards something having to do with the manufacturing technique being applied. And that means 30% of that they attribute to prefabrication, a very small pieces and parts, a very small amount to volumetric modules. And, then you're looking at things like robotics and automation and additive manufacturing. That's a big shift. Like almost half of the value in our industry is going to be towards processes that we don't technically, all of us have worked out well, right? We don't have causation yet for those. And that's really, again, like one of the reasons I came to Autodesk is to close those silos across the product portfolio, working with our products, working with other people's products, just to make things easier. Like we're basically saying to everyone, 50% of the time you have to speak French now. And we haven't given any French lessons. Like we need to start giving out some French lessons.
That's fantastic. So who are going to be the leaders of change? Is it people like Autodesk?
Well, I hope so.
That's creating the technology. You're the enabler, aren't you? You're going to say that, I know. But you're creating the tools. You're creating the French lessons, right?
I mean, I think honestly, I'd love to take credit for that, but I don't believe that. I think we have the frameworks and the customer base and the innovation and our culture to do it. But I think it's through our customers that are interacting with us and the big owners, the big serial owners that are interested in this. And the fact that we are now, creating this centralized knowledge base around this, for me in particular, around industrialized construction that needs to live somewhere and breathe somewhere and be fed somewhere. It's really a collaborative effort. So I would like to say that we are like, yes, we're enabling all the technology, but I think we're enabling this because again, I taught process for many years I was agnostic to tech, to be honest, for many years. And I realized I can't be agnostic anymore that it's not important. Like I don't have to be specific to one particular type of software, but you can't have just process. There needs to be people and culture change. You need to have technology change. You need to have process change in order to create change. And that can't come from one company. Again, you've got to really impact this ecosystem from the top down. And that
top are you starting from? You've mentioned the owners a few times. Is it the big developers that have got the money? They're saying we want a big project and this is how we want it done.
I think that's a big part of it. I think the top down is this. I think it's got to be the guys that have the money. Look, nothing happens in life without a purchase order, as we say. Maybe you don't use that phrasing, but nothing happens without a contract in life, right? So I can tell you that when people ask for things and they're paying for it, they typically tend to get it, right? Like, I mean, or they
have to
stop paying.
what they're asking for, and they've got to know something about it to say.
They do. And I need, like I is my personal, quest to educate owners to ask for things and not just push the risk away.
Yeah. So moving on to the big purchases in the world, which is governments, which are enormous. And you mentioned earlier that in the UK they've commissioned billions of dollars worth of new schools. Now, what's going on there? They're actually wanting BIM. They demand it. Now, we've covered that issue. We're actually invited to go to a conference on BIM in the UK, and we've actually held an event in Australia about it and actually did a book. And we find that it's a very slow process to get things off the ground. There's not a lot of understanding about it. What's going on there?
I think government right now, you've got to start asking for this, and that is has to happen, and they have to be asking for this in the right way, right? So just like any other big owner, they have to ask, and you have to ask the right way. You have to put the right procedures in place to ask. You need to know what you're asking for. You need to understand the maturity of the supply chain that you're asking. And if you look at any of the restarts from COVID, pretty much they're asking for three things, right? Like if you look across the world, they're asking for one, they want people to be digitized. They need digitization. They want people to utilize building information modeling software. That's first, right? You gotta be digital so that we have transparency, so that there's safety on the job site, so that they have look, the critical infrastructure these days is not necessarily roads. Like we're not driving anywhere during COVID, but we certainly needed the internet, and we needed to have, we needed to be in the cloud. So like I give a lot of credit to Autodesk a couple of years ago, pushing their strategy into the cloud and creating, all of our cloud products in, Autodesk Construction Cloud, because where would we be on these jobs? I feel like I get so many notices a day of clients thanking us. Had they not gotten on the journey 2 years ago prior to COVID, they wouldn't even be able, their jobs would have been dead stopped, right? So they're asking for digitization and utilization of building information modeling. They're asking for more sustainable practices like embedded carbon, and understanding, the carbon footprint of these processes. And the third thing they're asking for is industrialized construction. They want to see us doing more with less. They want to see us enabling the labor force to be in a manufacturing safer setting that can produce better quality and actually do more with less, because we have less resources. So those are the three things they're typically asking for right now in all the restarts. And that's important to recognize. Like this is not, unfortunately, the last time we're going to have an issue on this planet. We need to. It's so hard to pivot this giant ecosystem that if you didn't, I had a friend of mine 4 years ago say, this is not a journey anymore. It's a race. And if you don't recognize that, you're not winning. Like, why is it in other industries, people like Louis Vuitton could pivot and make, like PPE for face masks on a moment's notice, or, people that were manufacturing alcohol could start making hand sanitizer, and we can't get out of hospital bed without killing ourselves because we are not manufacturers. We are not able to pivot because we are focused on what people know in their heads on paper and means and methods. You cannot run, quote unquote, a business like that forever. Like we're in a place right now where that just doesn't fly anymore. And that's a problem.
Yeah. So now, Amy, I'd like to ask you more about resources. And you've alluded to that in the three things that you're saying that governments are wanting these days when they're doing restarts, or any big companies doing restarts. They're wanting developments to be digitised, they want to do more with less, and they want it to be sustainable. But I'm wondering, has anybody actually predicted what's going on with resources and where we're heading there?
Oh, for sure that's happening. I mean, like people are really focused on that. And I know at Autodesk, we have our own sustainability practice and group that's incredibly focused on.
Can you tell me a bit more about that as well?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, look, industrialized construction has the ability, one of the reasons I like it, aside from the initial selection of materials, right? You can reuse these. And
Right.
I think that these pieces and parts can be reutilized. These elements, these prefabricated elements, whether it's a head wall, whether it's a bathroom pad, whether it's a facade system, whether it's a hospital module, whatever that is, these prefabricated assemblies can be reutilized. And I think what's going to be very interesting about that for the future when it ties into sustainability practices is that we're all looking, somebody somewhere said like every building has to be a 50-year plus lifespan building. And it's like, does it? What technology do you know on this planet that lasts 50 years anymore? Like why does it have to be? Why isn't it that certain parts of the building are 50-year plus lifespan, but then we have swap outs for technology in the circular economy where we can reutilize tech and scale tech and not put in, like, think about data centers. We build giant data centers that have empty halls forever until they fill capacity, that we're heating and cooling all the time. Maybe not heating them where you live, but we're heating and cooling them in other places. Why are we just not scaling that with, building modules? Why is that not happening everywhere and only in some places? Instead, we're just wasting resources. And by the way, when you swap out for technology that's new, we get the best tech. It's like, look, I don't use my phone. My phone does not have a 50-year plus lifespan. There's nothing I do in the world anymore that has, I'm not looking for that kind of durability. I'm actually looking for a platform of products that allows me to swap things in and out as technology changes. A chassis, if you will, that allows me to swap things out as technology changes.
3XN, we had them at our event last year, and they were talking about designing a building where every component could be reused, not thrown out.